The Mars Trilogy by Stanley Robinson. So in this video, I'm going to go over the Mars Trilogy as a whole. I recently finished up this trilogy, and then I read the short story collection called The Martians. And what I'm going to do is briefly talk about the plot and themes of the trilogy, then go over some pros and cons, who might like to read it, and then towards the end of the video, I'm going to talk about this short story collection because it's quite a bit different than most of the other short story collections I've read, and kind of talk about whether you need to read it or not, or kind of my overall thoughts on it. So, first off, I'd like to say that I like to think of this trilogy personally as type 2 reading. And this is a term that I borrowed from the outdoor community. They have a term called type 2 fun. And that is when you're outside doing something and you might be miserable, you might be suffering through some long hike and you've got blisters and you're wondering why you're out there. But then you get home and you eat and you have a couple days and you recuperate and you look back on it very fondly. I feel the same way about this. There was sections of this trilogy that I struggled through. There was times where I really didn't want to pick up the book and read it again. And now that I'm done with it, I'm not remembering the negatives as much as the positives, and I'm really happy I read it. It was a challenge for me, and anytime you do something that is challenging and you complete it, it does give you a good feeling. So that's kind of my overall feelings now that I'm done with it. But let's go ahead and get into the plot line and themes of this trilogy. So most people know that this is a book about terraforming Mars, and the titles of the books are kind of a nod to the state of the planet as we go through time. So we go from red Mars to green Mars and blue Mars, and I'll hold up the covers of the book so you can see some of the artwork and how they depict the surface of the planet as we go through the trilogy. Now this trilogy, Stanley Robinson wrote this. We started off with the first book, 1993, the second book, 1994, and then the final book in the series was written in 1996. And if you total up all the pages, it's about 2,000 pages to get through the trilogy. Even though they look all about the same length, the word count on book 3 far exceeds the other two. It's a lot longer than it looks, and it took me a long time to finish up Blue Mars. So, real briefly, this whole trilogy basically starts with the first 100 colonists that were sent to Mars to set up a colony, make some habitable living spaces, and start a terraforming project to hopefully make the planet inhabitable by plants, animals, bacteria, everything, to one day maybe get it to where humans can live on the surface. So this book, when we start with Red Mars, this is probably the most engaging, fun book in the series. It has a different narrative structure than the rest of the books in the series. When we start off with this book, we start off towards the middle of the book with a teaser chapter, and then we work our way to match up with that timeline. And then once we get back to that timeline, then the rest of the book kind of takes a linear narrative structure. But our characters have a lot of conflict that happen with them. There's a lot of interpersonal relationship issues that happen with these first 100 in this book. And then we start to get some pressures from the people that are still on Earth as they start immigrating towards Mars, and what Earth wants these 100 to do with Mars. And like I said, most people know it's about this trilogy is about terraforming, but it's so much more than that. This encompasses so many branches of science, from hard sciences down all the way down to soft sciences. The one thing that it really hashes out is the psychology of people. One of the first 100 colonists that come to the planet is a psychologist, and you get a lot of chapters from his point of view, analyzing different characters. And this was a big surprise for me overall in the trilogy. From what I had heard, this trilogy reads like an instruction manual to terraform a planet. And while that is a big theme and there is a lot of time spent talking about that, I feel like it's almost equal or more about these characters and what's going through their minds, their wants, their desires, how they work amongst themselves. And that was a big surprise for me, and I really enjoyed it. It really helped keep me engaged through the trilogy, and I think it was probably the biggest aspect that made me finish it. Now, as we get into Green Mars, we kind of continue some of the same themes and plot lines, but we've progressed further. We have a planet that's got some flowing water on it now. They start introducing some different species out into the wild. And we just kind of continue the same themes that were brought up in the first book. Now, the second book was the hardest for me to get through. There's some long sections where you're just reading about scientific conferences where people are up there giving speeches about what's worked, what hasn't, what they could do to terraform the planet better. There's also conferences discussing the constitution of the planet, how they could set up political structures, how they could manage the resources and the land of the planet. And it is a pretty slow read. Then we get on to Blue Mars, and you can see that we have a more Earth-like planet, and it's another continuation of the same themes and plot lines. And I was really kind of struggling through the first 2/3 of this book and wasn't sure what I was going to think overall of the series. And then towards the end of the book, you get these last 3 chapters from 3 very interesting characters. And to me, it wrapped everything up perfectly. It put a bow on the whole series. There was a lot of introspective themes and ideas brought up. And I think for me as an older reader, it just hit home for me, and younger readers might not get the same out of it, and they might finish the series flat if you don't get that same kind of reward out of the end of this last book. But overall, you have a trilogy, 2,000 pages worth of a very well thought out thought experiment of how to start a whole new planet from everything, from every aspect of science, every idea. It is very, very well thought out, and overall I think Kim Stanley Robinson did an amazing job on the trilogy. Now let's get into some pros and cons. There's really 2 pros that carried the whole series for me. The first was unexpected, and it was the character work that was done. And that is really what kept me reading through it. I liked the psychology aspect that was brought into it. It made me think about my own interpersonal relationships with friends and families and coworkers. So that was probably the biggest pro for me. The second pro was just the amount of research that Kim Stanley Robinson did in all the aspects of the science, how well it was thought out, the attention to detail. Everything that he put into that aspect of the book was just amazing. Now let's get into some cons. So one of the biggest cons for me is the pacing. You could have really long chapters and sections of this trilogy that go over bland, dry scientific conferences or just people thinking out ways that they could do something differently. And then you have these really grand events, these amazing things that are happening that maybe only 2 paragraphs or very short sections discuss it. And I know it's probably hard to go over some of the science for some of these big, big, amazing things that happen in this book, but it was kind of difficult to slog through long sections of the book only to come up to some exciting aspect, some event that's going to happen, and it's just glossed over really quickly. So that was probably the biggest con for me. Another con was just the sheer length. This is 2,000 pages, and it felt bloated at times while I was reading it, but now that I'm looking back, it's debatable whether that bloat needed to be there or if it could have been shrunk down and a little bit more concise. So now who I think would maybe want to try reading this? Definitely if you're into hard science fiction and you want to take the time and you have the patience, give this a go. Start with the first book, of course, and you'll probably love the first half of the first book, like most people do. And then that second half, like I said, it's kind of a precursor for what the rest of the series is going to be. So finish the first book, and then from there you can make a decision if you want to go further. I think it's rewarding and you should give it a shot, but in the end, it's always up to you. Now, let's get into the short story collection. So when I first started reading this, the first story in this collection had me right from go, and I was so excited to see our characters again. And the first story in here goes over a training mission. So our first 100, before they left to go to Mars, they did this kind of training mission in Antarctica. And the first story takes place with them in Antarctica. And then I was loving it, and then I got really, really confused. And I was reading through some other stories, and I was just still going back to that first story, confused. And so I went to Kim Stanley Robinson's webpage, and he kind of gave a description of this book on there. And then it all made sense. And so what this short story collection is many things. So you have the Constitution of Mars is in here, completely written out. And so you can read that and see what the Constitution of Mars is. There's a big section of poetry that is in here, which I will admit, I kind of glossed over a lot of that. There's fictionalized scientific research papers kind of thrown in to this. There's stories about Mars in the timeline that the trilogy was in with new characters that we had never seen before. And there's also storylines in the same timeline with characters that we got to know from the Mars trilogy. And then this is the thing that got me. There's stories with our main characters, but it follows like a alternate reality where the mission got canceled. And so overall, the stories that I liked the most in this compilation were the stories that were based on our characters in the same timeline as the Mars trilogy. Now, I kind of wondered, why would you take characters and put them in an alternate reality and follow them along, and what purpose would that serve? And the only thing I can think of is Kim Stanley Robinson wrote this with such an emphasis on the characters. The only thing I can think of is maybe he wants to show that you could take these characters, put them in a completely different circumstance, and they're still ultimately the same people with the same psychological baggage, the same pros and cons of their personalities, and they're really just the same person in a different setting. So if that's what he was trying to get across, then I'm okay with that, but they still weren't my favorite stories. I think if you finish the trilogy, you don't need to read the short story collection at all. If you wanted to, you could probably look it up online and see which stories fit which arcs, and you could focus on just the stories you want to read, or you could gloss through some of the other stories. But to me, it really didn't enhance the trilogy at all too much. I definitely think you need to read this after you've read the entire trilogy. I wouldn't try to piece some of the storylines within the trilogy like chronologically. I would just wait till you finish, see if you want to come back to it, and give it a shot. So that's it for my review on this. If you watched it till the end, I thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.